The scream echoed through the German forest for 3 days straight. Villagers crossed themselves and whispered prayers, but none dared approach the tower where the sound originated. They knew what was happening inside. A girl was giving birth alone, cast out by the woman who had raised her. Meanwhile, somewhere in the wilderness, a blinded prince crawled through thorns, searching for the voice that had once called him up a tower of hair. This is not the Rapunzel you think you know. The brothers Grimm did not collect fairy tales. They documented crime scenes. Every element of the Rapunzel story reflects documented medieval practices so brutal that communities could only bear to remember them wrapped in the language of magic and enchantment. Tonight, you will discover why desperate parents traded their unborn child for a handful of bitter herbs when starvation meant choosing between a mother's craving and a family's survival. You will learn how religious predators build towers specifically designed to break young women. They used chemical treatments to make hair grow unnaturally long while conditioning victims for eventual sale to the highest bidder. You will meet the prince who climbed into hell through a rope of living hair. His secret visits and forbidden love led to a pregnancy that would destroy everything both had ever known. You will witness the innocent confession that led to brutal punishment. Careless words about pregnancy triggered savage retribution from a woman who viewed damaged property as theft of her investment. Finally, you will follow the trail of blood into the wilderness where justice was dispensed through thorns driven into eyes. Pregnant girls were abandoned to die, birthing children that few would survive to raise. This is the story of systematic brutality disguised as fairy tale magic. The real Rapunzel died screaming in a forest, abandoned by everyone who claimed to love her. Her story became a fairy tale because the truth was too horrifying for anyone to tell straight. But the records remain, and tonight, you will learn why some towers should never be climbed. Chapter 1. When Parents Feed Their Children to Witches. The hunger started in her 7th month. Margaret Zimmer had survived 3 pregnancies before, but this craving was different. It gnawed at her constantly, a desperate need for the bitter green leaves that grew in the forbidden garden next to St. Agatha's convent. Rampion, the nuns called it. Rapunzel in the local dialect. A medicinal herb that pregnant women craved with such intensity that medieval physicians documented it as a form of temporary madness. The year was 1542, and the Germanic states were experiencing one of the worst famines in recorded history. Families were boiling leather for soup and grinding tree bark into flour. In such times, a pregnant woman's craving for fresh greens was not just desire. It was biological desperation. Her body was literally demanding nutrients that could mean the difference between a living child and a stillbirth. But the garden belonged to Dame Godhel, the Mother Superior of St. Agatha's convent. Stealing from church property was punishable by excommunication, public flogging, or death. The rampion plants were worth more than most families earned in a month. Dame Godhel used them to treat everything from digestive ailments to difficult births. Her reputation as a healer brought steady income to the convent. Medieval medical texts describe pregnancy pica, though they attributed it to demonic influence rather than nutritional deficiency. Women would develop overwhelming cravings for specific substances, often things that were dangerous or forbidden. The medical establishment viewed these cravings as evidence that pregnant women were spiritually vulnerable to corruption. Margaret's husband, Klaus, watched his wife deteriorate for weeks before he made the decision that would cost them their firstborn child. She had stopped eating entirely, claiming that only the rampion could satisfy her hunger. She grew pale and weak, and Klaus feared she would miscarry. On a moonless night in October, he climbed the garden wall and stole enough rampion to fill a basket. The theft was discovered immediately. Dame Godhel maintained careful inventories of her medicinal plants. She had developed a system for dealing with such thefts that was both profitable and permanent. When Klaus confessed to save his wife from accusation of witchcraft, Dame Godhel offered him a choice that was no choice at all. He could face trial for theft from church property, which would result in his execution, or he could accept the church's mercy and pay for his crime through service. The service would require giving his child to the convent. Medieval documents show this was not unusual. Convents regularly acquired children through debt arrangements, criminal restitution, and family desperation. These children became unpaid labor while their families were absolved of both crime and financial burden. The practice was so common that church records include standardized contracts for such transactions. Klaus and Margaret sign away their unborn child on November 15, 1542. The contract stipulated that the child would be surrendered immediately upon weaning and would thereafter belong entirely to the church. The parents would have no further rights or contact. The child was born healthy in February 1543 and named Rapunzel after the plant that had caused such desperation. For 3 years, Margaret was allowed to nurse and care for her daughter while living under church supervision. This served multiple purposes for Dame Godhel. It ensured the child would survive the dangerous early years. It provided the convent with unpaid domestic labor. Most importantly, it allowed Dame Godhel to observe the child's development and plan her eventual use. When Rapunzel turned 3, Dame Godhel declared the child ready for religious education. The separation was swift and absolute. Margaret and Klaus were given 1 day to say goodbye, then escorted from church property with warnings that any attempt to contact the child would result in excommunication. Church law granted religious authorities absolute control over such children. The children became property of the church, to be used as the religious authorities saw fit. For Dame Godhel, 3-year-old Rapunzel represented a long-term investment. The child was healthy, intelligent, and beautiful enough to command premium prices in whatever market Dame Godhel eventually chose to explore. The tower that would become Rapunzel's prison was constructed in the late 15th century as part of defensive structures around the convent. But Dame Godhel had recognized its potential for other purposes. The tower's isolation, its single high window, and its complete separation from the main buildings made it perfect for housing individuals who needed to be kept alive but forgotten. When Rapunzel was moved to the tower at age 12, Dame Godhel told the other nuns that the girl was being prepared for hermetic contemplation. This explanation satisfied church authorities while concealing the true purpose. Rapunzel was not being prepared for religious life. She was being preserved and prepared for sale when she reached the age where such transactions became most profitable. The parents who had traded their daughter for bitter herbs never learned what became of her. They spent their lives believing they had saved their child's soul through sacrifice. They never knew they had delivered her in a hell designed to break everything that made her human. Chapter 2. The Hair That Binds the Living to the Dead. The hair began growing when Rapunzel turned 13, and within months it had reached lengths that defied natural explanation. Dame Godhel documented this phenomenon in her private medical journals, not as a miracle, but as the successful result of careful regimen of herbs, isolation, and systematic conditioning. Medieval medical texts describe several conditions that could cause abnormal hair growth in adolescent girls. Hormonal imbalances brought on by malnutrition, certain herbal treatments, and extreme psychological stress could all trigger rapid hair growth that seemed supernatural. Dame Godhel had learned to cultivate these conditions deliberately. She used restricted diet, medicinal herbs, and emotional manipulation to achieve desired results. The tower where Rapunzel lived was designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining physical health. 20 feet high, with walls 4 feet thick, it contained a single room with no interior stairs. The only access was through a window 15 feet from ground. This design ensured complete dependence while creating desperate isolation that would make her victim more compliant. Dame Godhel visited daily, lowering a basket to provide food, water, and herbal medicines she claimed were necessary for spiritual development. The medicines included compounds derived from black hellebore and white bryony. These are plants known to affect hair growth and mental state. Medieval herbalists understood that certain combinations could produce dramatic physical changes. However, they attributed effects to supernatural rather than chemical causes. The isolation itself was psychological torture that medieval religious authorities had refined into an art form. Complete separation from human contact, except for controlled interactions with a single authority figure, could break down identity and replace it with total dependence. Dame Godhel understood that a girl isolated from childhood would develop attachment so strong that she would cooperate in her own imprisonment. Rapunzel's daily routine was structured to maximize psychological dependence while maintaining physical beauty. She was required to maintain detailed personal hygiene, exercise regularly, and spend hours each day grooming her increasingly long hair according to Dame Gothel's specifications. The hair grooming was particularly important to Dame Gothel's plans. She required Rapunzel to wash, oil, and braid her hair in complex patterns that showcased its length. As the hair grew longer, these sessions became increasingly time-consuming, sometimes taking 6 hours per day. This kept Rapunzel occupied, maintained the hair in prime condition, and created daily ritual that reinforced her role as an object to be maintained rather than a person with independent will. By age 15, Rapunzel's hair had grown to over 6 feet in length, far beyond what would occur naturally. Dame Gothel's herbal treatments, combined with restricted diet and constant grooming, had produced hair that was extraordinarily long, unusually strong and thick. Medieval documents describe hair that could support significant weight without breaking. This suggests chemical treatments had altered the hair's structure in ways that seemed magical. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation were equally dramatic. Church visitors occasionally allowed to see Rapunzel reported that she spoke in a childlike manner despite her age. She showed excessive attachment to Dame Godhel and demonstrated learned helplessness that medieval physicians associated with demonic possession. These were classic symptoms of trauma bonding and institutional dependency. Dame Godhel encouraged psychological regression because it made her more valuable in markets where such transactions occurred. Noble families seeking exotic entertainment would pay premium prices for young women who displayed childlike innocence combined with unusual physical characteristics. The combination of extraordinary hair length and psychological dependency made Rapunzel exactly the kind of curiosity that wealthy collectors sought. The hair became both Rapunzel's defining characteristic and the instrument of her continued imprisonment. Dame Godhel trained the girl to lower her braided hair from the tower window on command. This created a living rope that could support an adult's weight. It eliminated the need for rope or ladder equipment during visits, while reinforcing Rapunzel's role as a tool rather than a person. Medieval accounts describe the physical toll this practice took on Rapunzel's scalp and neck. Supporting an adult's weight with hair caused significant pain and occasionally resulted in patches being torn out by the roots. Dame Godhel treated these injuries with herbal poultices that promoted healing while ensuring the hair would grow back thicker and stronger. The psychological symbolism of using Rapunzel's own hair as the means of imprisonment was not lost on Dame Godhel. She understood that forcing victims to participate in their own captivity created deeper psychological control than simple physical restraint. By making Rapunzel's hair the key to both connection and imprisonment, Dame Godhel ensured that the girl would associate her most distinctive feature with her captor's presence and approval. As Rapunzel entered her late teens, Dame Godhel began receiving inquiries from potential buyers who had heard rumors about the girl in the tower. The long hair had become legendary among certain circles of noble collectors. Dame Godhel knew that the time was approaching when her investment would generate its intended return. The hair that had grown in isolation, strengthened by chemicals and psychological manipulation, had become both Rapunzel's most valuable asset and the chain that bound her to a fate she could not imagine. Dame Godhel had created exactly what she intended. She had created a human curiosity so unique that wealthy collectors would compete to possess her. Meanwhile, she ensured that the girl remained too psychologically damaged to resist whatever destiny awaited her beyond the tower walls. Chapter 3. The Prince Who Climbed into Hell. Prince Friedrich von Hagen was not the romantic hero of fairy tale imagination. He was a 22-year-old minor noble with documented gambling debts and a reputation for reckless behavior. When he discovered Rapunzel in her tower during a hunting expedition in 1559, he saw an opportunity for adventure and romance that seemed to exist outside the rigid social constraints of medieval court life. Medieval court records paint a picture of Friedrich's character and circumstances. He had been struggling financially due to poor investments and gambling losses. His family had been pressuring him to marry advantageously to restore their fortunes. But Friedrich had been avoiding these arrangements in favor of pursuing his own interests. His discovery of Rapunzel represented an escape from these pressures into what seemed like a romantic adventure. The discovery of Rapunzel was accidental, but immediately captivating to Friedrich's imagination. While hunting alone in the forest surrounding St. Agatha's convent, he heard singing coming from the isolated tower and investigated. What he found was a beautiful 16-year-old girl with extraordinarily long hair, living alone in a tower with no apparent guardian present. Friedrich's first visit to the tower revealed both Rapunzel's extraordinary isolation and the extent to which Dame Gothel's conditioning had affected her understanding of the world. The girl had been so isolated that she had no knowledge of courtship customs, no understanding of the social barriers that should have prevented their relationship, and no conception that their meetings might have consequences beyond the immediate pleasure of companionship. Medieval documents show that Friedrich carefully observed Dame Gothel's routine before making his unauthorized visits. He noted the timing of her visits to the tower and identified periods when he could access Rapunzel without detection. This careful planning was motivated not by predatory intent, but by the practical need to avoid discovery of a relationship that would have serious consequences for both participants. The hair ladder itself presented both opportunity and symbolic significance for Friedrich's courtship of Rapunzel. The physical act of climbing her hair was difficult and dangerous, requiring significant trust from both participants. For Friedrich, it represented a dramatic gesture of devotion that elevated their relationship above the mundane, arranged marriages he was trying to avoid. Friedrich's visits became regular occurrences over several months. He would arrive during periods when Dame Gothel was absent, call for Rapunzel to lower her hair, and spend hours in the tower talking with her about the outside world and sharing stories of court life. These conversations filled Rapunzel's isolated existence with dreams of freedom and romance that she had never imagined possible. The relationship that developed between Friedrich and Rapunzel was complicated by their vastly different experiences and social positions. Friedrich brought knowledge of the outside world and stories of life beyond the tower, while Rapunzel offered the kind of innocent devotion that had been impossible to find among the sophisticated women of medieval courts who were primarily interested in advantageous marriages. Medieval medical texts describe the psychological effects of prolonged isolation on young women and how such isolation could create intense emotional attachments when human contact was finally restored. Rapunzel's response to Friedrich's attention was probably much stronger than what would occur in normal courtship situations, creating a relationship dynamic that neither participant fully understood. Friedrich's feelings toward Rapunzel appear to have been genuinely romantic, though complicated by his lack of understanding about her psychological condition and the circumstances of her imprisonment. He believed he was conducting a secret courtship with a girl who had chosen religious seclusion, not realizing that she was actually a captive being prepared for purposes that had nothing to do with spiritual development. The progression of their relationship toward physical intimacy was probably inevitable given Rapunzel's complete isolation and Friedrich's romantic intentions. Medieval courtship often involved extended periods of private conversation and emotional intimacy before marriage, and their unusual circumstances created an environment where normal social boundaries did not exist. When Rapunzel became pregnant, neither participant fully understood the implications of their situation. Friedrich assumed their relationship would eventually lead to marriage once he could arrange proper settlements with her guardian. Rapunzel, who had no understanding of pregnancy or childbirth, initially did not recognize her condition or comprehend why Dame Gothel reacted with such fury when the relationship was discovered. Friedrich's reaction to the discovery of the relationship and Rapunzel's pregnancy was initially one of confusion rather than calculation. He had genuinely believed their romance was developing toward marriage and could not understand why Dame Gothel viewed their relationship as theft rather than courtship. His attempts to negotiate a proper marriage arrangement revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of Rapunzel's actual situation. Medieval documents suggest that Friedrich's involvement with Rapunzel was motivated by romantic idealism rather than exploitation, though his lack of understanding about her circumstances made him complicit in a situation that would ultimately destroy both their lives. His climb into the tower had brought him into a world of systematic brutality that he was unprepared to navigate or escape. Chapter 4. The Confession That Spilled Blood. The words that destroyed everything were spoken on a Tuesday morning in March 1560, and they were so innocent that Rapunzel did not understand their significance until Dame Gothel's knife was already cutting through her hair. The confession came during what Rapunzel believed was a normal conversation with her guardian, but Dame Gothel had carefully orchestrated the moment to extract the truth about Prince Friedrich's visits and the pregnancy that threatened to ruin years of careful investment. Dame Gothel had suspected the unauthorized visits for weeks before confirmation came. Rapunzel's behavior had changed in subtle ways that an experienced observer would recognize. She had become more animated during their daily conversations, asking questions about the outside world that suggested contact with someone who had filled her head with ideas about life beyond the tower. More significantly, she had begun showing the early signs of pregnancy that Dame Gothel's medical knowledge allowed her to identify before the girl herself understood her condition. The interrogation technique Dame Gothel used was perfected through decades of extracting information from young women who had been taught to trust her completely. She began with seemingly casual questions about Rapunzel's daily activities, gradually building toward more specific inquiries about any unusual occurrences or visitors. The psychological conditioning that had made Rapunzel compliant and dependent also made her incapable of sustained deception when questioned by her primary authority figure. Medieval documents describe the specific methods religious authorities used to extract confessions from individuals who might be concealing information about sexual impropriety. These techniques combined psychological manipulation with threats of spiritual punishment, creating pressure that most victims found impossible to resist. Dame Gothel was particularly skilled at this process because she understood how to exploit the emotional dependency she had cultivated in her captives. The actual confession came when Dame Gothel asked Rapunzel to explain why her hair had become more difficult to manage during recent weeks. This seemingly innocent question was designed to lead Rapunzel toward admitting that someone had been climbing her hair, which would explain the increased stress and damage Dame Gothel had observed. Rapunzel, who had been taught that honesty was essential to spiritual development, readily explained that her hair had been used frequently as a ladder by her visitor. Dame Gothel's response was swift and calculated to maximize psychological impact, while extracting complete information about the relationship. She expressed shock and horror at Rapunzel's revelation, claiming that the girl had been corrupted by demonic influences and needed immediate spiritual cleansing to save her soul. This reaction triggered the kind of desperate compliance that Dame Gothel knew would make Rapunzel confess everything about her relationship with Friedrich. The detailed confession that followed revealed not only the extent of Friedrich's exploitation, but also Rapunzel's complete ignorance about the nature of what had been done to her. She described their relationship in terms that made clear she had been systematically sexually abused while believing she was experiencing romantic love. Her account of Friedrich's behavior related with the innocence of someone who had never been taught to recognize predatory actions, provided Dame Gothel with detailed evidence of criminal activity that could be used against the prince if necessary. Medieval legal documents show that confessions extracted through religious authority carried significant weight in both church and civil courts. A detailed account of sexual impropriety, obtained from a victim under religious supervision, could be used to bring charges that would ruin a noble's reputation and potentially result in criminal penalties. Dame Gothel understood the value of such evidence and carefully documented every detail of Rapunzel's confession for potential future use. The cutting of the hair that followed was not an act of rage, but a calculated punishment designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Dame Gothel needed to eliminate the means by which Friedrich had been accessing the tower, demonstrate to Rapunzel the consequences of deception and disobedience, and create physical evidence of the girl's corruption that would justify whatever punishment she decided to impose. The actual cutting process was brutal in its psychological impact. Dame Gothel used a sharp knife to saw through the braided hair, while forcing Rapunzel to hold still and watch years of growth being destroyed in minutes. The hair that had defined Rapunzel's identity and served as her only connection to another human being was severed and discarded like refuse, leaving the girl not only physically altered but psychologically devastated. Medieval accounts describe the symbolic significance of cutting a woman's hair as punishment for sexual impropriety. The practice was common in religious institutions and served multiple purposes beyond simple humiliation. Cut hair could not be used to facilitate escape or unauthorized contact. The visible evidence of punishment served as a warning to other women about the consequences of disobedience. Most importantly, the loss of hair was considered a form of spiritual purification that prepared the victim for whatever additional punishments were deemed necessary. Dame Gothel preserved the cut hair rather than destroying it, understanding that the extraordinary length and quality would still have commercial value in markets where such items were prized for wig-making and other decorative purposes. Even in punishment, she ensured that her investment would generate some return while serving its disciplinary function. The psychological impact of the hair cutting on Rapunzel was more devastating than any physical punishment could have been. Her hair had been her primary source of identity and her only means of connection with another human being. Its loss left her not only isolated but stripped of everything that had made her feel valuable or significant. Dame Gothel understood that this psychological destruction was necessary preparation for the final phase of Rapunzel's punishment. The confession that had begun as innocent honesty had led directly to the destruction of everything Rapunzel valued about herself and her life. But Dame Gothel was not finished with her punishment. The pregnancy that Rapunzel still did not fully understand would require additional measures that would test whether the girl had any survival instincts left after years of conditioning and the trauma of losing her defining characteristic. Friedrich's role in the events that led to this destruction was not forgotten by Dame Gothel, who understood that allowing his exploitation to go unpunished would encourage other predators to target her property. The prince would soon discover that damaged goods had a price, and that price would be paid in ways he had not anticipated when he first climbed a tower of hair, seeking consequence-free entertainment. Chapter 5. Eyes full of thorns, wombs full of death. The thorns were waiting for Prince Friedrich when he arrived at the tower 3 days after Rapunzel's hair was cut. Dame Gothel had spent those days carefully preparing what she called appropriate consequences for his theft of church property and corruption of an innocent girl. The brambles that surrounded the base of the tower had been cultivated for decades, their sharp spines hardened by careful pruning and positioning to create an effective barrier against unwanted visitors. Friedrich's final visit to the tower was motivated by desperation rather than desire. Word had begun circulating in noble circles about his involvement with a girl from the convent, and his family was demanding explanations that he could not provide without admitting to behavior that would ruin his reputation. He hoped to convince Rapunzel to flee with him, eliminating the evidence of their relationship while gaining access to whatever value she might have in distant markets where questions would not be asked. The discovery that Rapunzel's hair had been cut was the first indication that Friedrich's plans would not proceed as anticipated. Without the hair ladder, the tower window was inaccessible by normal means, and his calls to Rapunzel received no response. Dame Gothel had positioned the girl at the window, specifically so Friedrich would see her altered appearance and understand that his access had been permanently severed. The bramble trap that caught Friedrich was constructed with the precision that medieval defensive engineers used for military fortifications. The thorns had been positioned and shaped to catch an adult's body and hold it securely while inflicting maximum damage to soft tissue, particularly the eyes and face. Dame Gothel had studied accounts of similar defensive systems and understood exactly how to position the spines for optimal effectiveness. Friedrich's blinding was not instantaneous, but occurred over the course of several hours as he struggled against the thorns that held him trapped. Medieval medical texts describe the specific injuries that result from prolonged contact with sharp organic spines, including puncture wounds that become infected, lacerations that sever important blood vessels, and eye damage that leads to permanent blindness. Friedrich survived the initial injuries, but was permanently blinded and severely scarred by the thorns. His family retrieved him after several days and arranged for medical treatment, but the extent of his injuries made it impossible to conceal what had happened. The scandal of his involvement with a convent girl, combined with the obvious evidence of violent punishment, destroyed his social position and eliminated any possibility of advantageous marriage or political advancement. Meanwhile, Rapunzel faced her own ordeal in the wilderness where Dame Gothel had abandoned her to die during childbirth. The forest surrounding the convent was deliberately chosen for this purpose because it was isolated enough that screams would not be heard, while being sufficiently dangerous that survival would be virtually impossible for someone without wilderness experience. Medieval medical texts describe the specific challenges facing women who gave birth without assistance in outdoor environments. The mortality rate for both mothers and children was over 90%, with death usually resulting from blood loss, infection, exposure, or predation by wild animals. Dame Gothel understood these statistics and chose wilderness abandonment specifically because it would eliminate Rapunzel and her child while appearing to be natural causes rather than murder. Rapunzel's survival during the birth of her twins was so statistically unlikely that contemporary observers attributed it to divine intervention rather than chance. Medieval birth records show that twin births had mortality rates approaching 100% when they occurred without medical assistance, particularly when the mother was malnourished and psychologically traumatized. The eventual reunion between the blinded Friedrich and Rapunzel with her children represented not a fairy tale ending, but the coming together of broken people whose lives had been destroyed by their involvement with each other. Friedrich's blindness left him dependent on others for basic survival, while Rapunzel's psychological trauma and the demands of caring for damaged children ensured that she would never be able to function independently in normal society.